Chapter 16. The wailing barely registered above Jeff's head as the ambulance swung around first one corner and then another. At least it felt like swinging to his perilous hold on reality. Every turn sent his shoulder crashing into the door, but it wasn't the recklessness of the driver so much as the weakness in his body that was betraying his balance. What little strength was left, he was fighting to will through the metal partition and into the back. Dustin needed the strength far more than he did. With that thought, others he didn't want to think flooded over him, and he squeezed his eyes shut to block them out. Finally, they screeched to a stop under the emergency room canopy, and the driver jumped out. Even the pain didn't make it all the way through his swirling thoughts as Jeff reached down, popped the door open, and all but fell out of the cab. Like a drunk on Saturday night, his steps threaded around the front of the vehicle to the other side, where blinding light cut right through his brain. 6 green-clad medical personnel already surrounded the single white gurney indented with 2 solid black boots, and in seconds they had slipped through the sliding glass doors. He wanted to follow them, but his spirit was the only thing still moving. "He's as okay as he can be right now," AJ said, striding up to Jeff from the back of the ambulance. "And he's in good hands. Come on, let's get you taken care of." When the phone by her bed rang, Lisa rolled over and squinted at the clock. 4:22. Gingerly, she sat up and scratched the side of her head. She cleared her throat and retrieved the receiver. "Hello? Lisa? Yeah? This is AJ Knight." The name sounded familiar. Where had she heard that name again? "Listen, I thought you should know Jeff's in the emergency room." Sleep's shackles shattered as her whole body wrenched up off the pillows. "What?" "I don't have time to go into details, but he's at Ben Taub General. Tell them your family. They'll let you back. Sorry, I've got to go. But Lisa?" "Yeah?" "Come, okay? He needs somebody." The middle of her hurt like it had never hurt before. Somewhere in the middle of the phone call, her heart had stopped, and with it her breathing. "Please, please, please, God, please let him be all right." When the white Cavalier rounded the last corner, even that prayer stopped. She counted 4 ambulances, all with their lights on, lined up next to the curb, and she knew it was bad. No, it was really bad. Really, really bad. Those words put wind under her feet as she jumped from the car and raced through the doors to the information desk. "May I help you?" the receptionist asked. "Yes, there was a firefighter brought in earlier. I'm his—" She looked down at her naked hand and carefully slid it under her other arm. "Fiancé." "Name?" Jeff Taylor." A pause as the computer worked on locating him. "Yes, he's in emergency bay 14. "And emergency is—" "Through these doors and to the right." "Thank you," Lisa said, fighting for breath as her steps picked up speed. The rubber of her tennis shoes thumped against the hard floor. At the doors, she pushed through them with one hand and entered a world of smattered commands and frightened weeping. Forcing resolve into the void in her heart, she half walked, half ran all the way to the sign reading admissions. Chaos. People, carts, medical equipment everywhere, and voices raking right over the top of them. She considered stopping to ask for directions, but there wasn't an unoccupied hospital employee anywhere. Instead, she turned her steps to the curtains on the side that read 1, 2, 3 above them. Never before would she have been so bold, but there was no thinking involved in this decision. At 14, she took one breath and pulled the curtain back slightly, just enough to look inside, and her soul shifted beneath her. In the next heartbeat, she was in the cubicle and at his side as he lay on the bed, gaze melded to the ceiling. On soft feet, she stepped over to the bed, aware that he hadn't seen her, although he was clearly awake. One gentle hand reached over and brushed the hair from across the grime-stained forehead. "Jeff?" Uncomprehendingly, he looked at her and blinked. "Lisa?" "Yeah," she said, trying desperately to squelch the tears. His chest heaved as anguish filled his face. "Lisa?" "I'm here." He reached for her, seemingly oblivious to the blood-red bandages covering both his hands. Her mind pushed that away from her. He was alive. All else they could handle. She held him, fighting to breathe through the horror crowding her heart. "I don't think Dustin made it," he said, and her mind collapsed around the statement. "What?" She pulled back from him. "Dustin? But—" "They called in all units," Jeff said as he released her and lay back into the plastic pillow. "We were trying to get some people out." "Shh," she said, realizing that if he freaked out, she might not be able to calm him back down. "Shh, just relax. I'll go ask, okay?" His eyes dipped back into the haze as he nodded and slipped further into the pillow. The gaze drifted back up to the ceiling as her spirit fell within her. Struggling to stay stoic in the face of an incomprehensible situation, she stepped out of the bay, sniffed once, and squared her shoulders for the admissions desk. "Yes, I need to know the status of a firefighter, Dustin Knox." "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't." "Don't tell me you can't," she said as emotions crashed into her from every side. "He and his wife are close personal friends of ours, and if he's here and as bad as my fiancé thinks he is, then his wife needs to be notified." The young man sighed. "What's your fiancé's name?" "Jeff Taylor," she said, doing that hide the left hand maneuver again. "He's in Bay 14, burned hands." Charred seemed to be a better word, but her heart couldn't take being that honest. "And the other name?" "Dustin Knox." Her breath snagged at the top of her throat just below the prayers for Eve, for Dustin, for all of them. A pause, and then, "According to my records, Mr. Knox is in CCU, the critical care burn unit on the 6th floor, but he's not allowed any visitors at this time." "Oh," the syllable stopped as her world reeled on the news. "Okay, thanks." He nodded as her grief and shock reflected in his eyes. Carefully, she turned back. She wished she knew more, and yet one part of her was glad she didn't. At the curtain, she stopped and called for God himself to help her with her next task. Quietly, she slipped back into the cubicle and over to the bed. That never-blinking stare unnerved her to the very core. She couldn't lie, so her hand, that bare-naked left one, slipped up to his arm as the tears stung her skull. "He's in CCU. They didn't know anymore." For one moment, Jeff's gaze turned to hers, which he searched to the depths of. Then he nodded, turned his head, and regained his silent conversation with the ceiling. She had never felt more helpless in all of her life. Do you know Eve's number? I think we should call her," she finally said. His gaze snapped downward to the sheet at his leg, and she wished there was a way around asking. "I didn't have the new one memorized yet." His voice sounded weaker with every word. "Is it at your apartment?" The nod wasn't even really there. "My keys are in my locker at the station. It's number 24 on the bottom. The book's in my top drawer next to the sink." She didn't want to leave him, not like this, but want and need were two very different things. Slowly, his gaze slid down from the ceiling and landed on hers. "I'll be all right. Eve needs to know." Emotion took over then as she leaned down to him and pulled the warmth of his kiss into her. Fighting the grief, she pulled away from him, and his gaze narrowed on hers seriously. "Drive careful, okay?" Never had she taken an admonition more to heart. He couldn't afford to lose someone else tonight. Rational gained the upper hand as the white Cavalier banked into the station parking lot. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it. Her friends were counting on her, whether any of them knew it or not. With long strides, she entered the vacant fire station. "Visitor!" she called, presumably for the benefit of the spiders in the corners, because no one else heard it. Lockers. Steeling her nerve, she walked down the hallway to the door beyond the break room, where she knocked solidly. Nothing. Carefully, she opened the door. "Knock, knock." Still nothing. She stepped into the room, past the benches, to the lockers. 24, 24. When she found it, her shaking fingers touched the cold metal and slid it upward. His locker. Somehow, she never thought she would see it. Staring into it, she couldn't help but feel his spirit wrap around her. Pushing the thought of Eve down, she grabbed the keys off the top shelf and then caught sight of the cross. In a split second, it was in her hand, and she was off to the next stop in this nightmare of a plan. It was like the world had forgotten him. Jeff could hear it, over the curtain, under the curtain, all around him. He could hear the pleas for help, the cries of pain, the ache of humanity just beyond that thin veil, and for all his heart, he wished that he would never again have to rejoin it. Lisa placed the first call from his apartment and was surprised to only get the answering machine. She left a vague message saying she would try back again. That wasn't the kind of news one delivers via answering machines. The second call she placed from the payphone in the hospital lobby. In the rush to get to him, she had forgotten her cell phone. This time, when she got the answering machine, she wondered if Eve was already here. Maybe someone had already gotten in touch with her. That thought lifted the pallor around her heart. Willing her steps to be steady beneath her, Lisa walked down the hallway, through the doors, past the admissions desk, and right to Bay 14. When she peeked into the curtain, her heart fell. He hadn't moved during the last hour, not a single inch. "I got you something," she said, approaching the bed slowly as the tiny bag of clothes she had procured from his place banged on her leg. Vacantly, he looked at her, and with a soft, hopeful smile, she held up the gold chain and cross, letting it dangle at the bottom of her fingertips. In the next instant, grief flooded across his features as he looked first at it, then at her. "You want me to put it on you?" she asked, and the imperceptible nod was unnecessary. Except to con a pitcher of water from a nurse once, Lisa left his side only to place her every 15 minutes phone call. By the time morning washed across a sky they couldn't see, Bay 14 had become their temporary home. She did everything she knew to do to make him more comfortable, which wasn't difficult. He was hazed out, barely acknowledging that the rest of the planet even existed. At 7:50, she looked at her watch. Presumably, they would get to him eventually, but his injuries didn't make it as high on the scale of life or death as too many of the other emergency room occupants had that night. Worse, even on a good night, she had heard of 8 to 10 hour horror story waits. It wasn't difficult to see they were a mere 3 hours into theirs. Sunday morning, the first one that she had really thought about church in years. Now her mind wondered, if she had just gone the week before, would it have made any difference? Would Jeff not be lying here? Would Dustin be at home enjoying the breakfast Eve had waiting? Slowly, Lisa shook her head. She didn't understand any of this, and something told her she never would. There was a bed shortage in the area hospitals. The scene the night before told Jeff that much. So, after the doctor appeared sometime around 11, did what he could with the blistering skin that covered Jeff's palms, and then asked if he wouldn't be more comfortable at home, Jeff understood enough to say, of course he would. Really, it didn't matter. He wasn't leaving anyway. With slow movements, he slipped out of the ash-covered shirt he had spent the night in, laid it on the bed, and picked up the one Lisa had put across the chair for him before she had quietly slipped out. A sleeve at a time, he worked the fabric over the bandages and onto his body. The fact that he couldn't have worked the buttons if he tried never occurred to him until the blue plaid was draped across his shoulders. Overwhelming helplessness in the face of all he had been through washed over him when he tried to take hold of the first button, and his knees went weak beneath him. "All better?" her voice asked at the curtain, and he looked up as pain slashed through him. "I can't get this thing buttoned," he said, and the words broke with the weight of the unshed tears. With a gentleness he had never experienced, she stepped over to him, took the top button in her fingers, and slid it into its rightful place. Down, one button at a time until they were all exactly where they were supposed to be. Then she took the bottom edge of the shirt and carefully worked it under the waistband of his jeans. When she was finished, her gaze locked on his. Better? Much. She turned and began picking up the heavy fire suit from the floor. If it's not too much trouble," he said, and when she looked at him, he held up both sleeves to reveal the cuff buttons dangling loose. She looked at it, questioning what she could do about that because it was obvious they were not going to close around the bandages. "You could roll them up," he suggested softly. Her skepticism slid into a smile, and she dropped her former task in a heap. A roll at a time, she turned the sleeves until both stopped just at his biceps. Then she stepped back. "Anything else?" Short of going back 24 hours and changing everything, he could think of nothing. "I guess that's it." Together, they crossed out of Bay 14 and back into life. After a quick check with her buddy at the admissions desk to make sure Dustin's condition hadn't changed, they went for breakfast, which Lisa had to insist that Jeff eat, bite by bite, until at least half of it was gone. The hands were going to be a problem, but she did her best to make sure they didn't interfere and remind him any more than they had to. When they went back to the hospital and up to the 6th floor, she stayed close to his side. Steady could hardly describe him. His steps swayed just as precariously as his spirit seemed to be. "Excuse me, we're wanting to find out about Dustin Knox," Lisa said at the nurse's station as determination echoed in her voice. "He's a firefighter that was brought in last night." The lady behind the desk looked at Lisa doubtfully. "He's a friend of mine," Jeff said, pulling the lady's gaze to him. The next second slid by, and then, just as she looked about to tell them to go away, the lady glanced down and caught sight of the bandages on his hand. "Are you?" She nodded. "Let me check." Her fingers clicked over the keys. "Mr. Knox is in critical condition. Only close family every 2 hours for 10 minutes. "When is the next visit time?" Lisa asked. 20 minutes, the nurse said, checking the clock. "Have you gotten in touch with his family yet?" Lisa asked, holding her breath for the answer. "No, ma'am. The department's been overwhelmed with this thing. I'm surprised we even know his name." It wasn't what Lisa wanted to hear, but she smiled anyway. "Okay." She looked around. "Where do we wait?" "Through those doors. There's chairs. Coffee, too, although I wouldn't recommend it." Lisa nodded. "Thank you." What she wanted to do was take his hand. Instead, she wound her arm under his and guided him across the lobby. "You know, Eve's machine is going to get tired of hearing from me." "I just wish I knew where she was," he said softly. "Yeah, so do I." Ever since he had seen that boot in the burst of flames, Jeff had tried to prepare himself for this moment, lining up the words in his head just in case he ever got the chance to say them. Now was his chance, but the tears choking out the air wouldn't let the words come as he stepped over to the unmoving figure on the bed. Dustin lay face down on the white sheets, and Jeff's own hands were no match for the strips of charred and crimson flesh rippling up and down Dustin's back. Jeff tried not to look too closely, for fear that his composure would collapse completely. "Hey, Dustin, man. What's up?" How many times had he said those words? 500,000? But they had never, ever felt like this. Defiantly, he pushed that away as he pulled a chair over to the bed. Dustin's arm, bent at the elbow, wound up next to the short brown hair so that his hand lay right next to his still closed eyes. "Boy, this really stinks, huh?" Jeff blew the air out of his lungs slowly. "Listen, we're trying to get in touch with Eve. Lisa's on perpetual vigil by the phone. We'll get her here, though. Don't worry. We will." I know she wants to be here with you. I know she would be if she knew." He sniffed back the tears and ran his cheek down the plaid sleeve. "You know, I know, if you can, you're going to come back to us. So don't take this like I'm writing you off or anything. But there's some things I think you should know. I didn't get to say them last time, and—" He closed his eyes to stop the words. The breath out was harder to control this time. "I want you to know how much I appreciated all those hours we spent together. I know you had Eve, and you didn't have to make time to include me, but you did. I appreciate that." Pulling the tears back to him, he sniffed. "More than you'll ever know. You should also know that I'd never have made it through the academy without you. Back in November, oh man, every time I needed someone, you were always there, although I think you talked more than you listened." A small laugh jumped through the center of the tears. "When didn't you, huh? But I needed that. I really did. There wasn't a second all the way through the academy that I wasn't glad to have you by my side." The tears came again. "Not one single second." The words stopped, held by the invisible grip of grief. "Look, we both know this thing's bad. Yeah, we do. But if God thinks you've got some more to do here, then you've got to know that I'll be right by your side every step of the way, no matter what." A sound at the door, and Jeff looked over to where a nurse slipped in. When she saw him, she stopped, unsure of what to do next. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone—" "That's okay," Jeff said, swiping at the tears with his own bandages. "I'd better let him get some sleep." He looked at the closed eyes one more time, said a silent goodbye, and stepped away from the bed. At the door, he could hardly catch his breath for the tears, and it was at that moment that the nurse laid a soft, comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll do everything we can," she said gently. He knew that, of course, but as he stepped out into the bright room beyond, he couldn't help but think their best wouldn't be enough. Shoulder to shoulder they sat in the little waiting room as the seconds turned to minutes and the minutes turned to hours. At 5:30, Lisa tried to talk him into going home to get some sleep, but she knew even saying the words was pointless. No, he needed to be here, and so did she too. They had managed to get in touch with Dustin's fire station, but between the two shifts that fought the fire, there weren't enough men to spare one at the hospital. At 7, Jeff had willed his way to the phone and called his own department. No one he knew was there, but they took a message anyway. "I think I'll go try Eve again," Lisa said just before 8 when the waiting began to grate across her nerves. At the payphone, she deposited her dwindling supply of quarters and listened to the phone ring. However, the 4th ring never made it across the wires. "Hello?" The voice sounded fragile and frightened. "Eve?" "Yeah?" "Eve, this is Lisa." "Lisa? I just got home. What in the world is going on?" Can you get down to Ben Taub General right away?" Lisa asked, forcing her voice to sound urgent but not dire. "We're on the 6th floor." "How's Dustin?" "We'll talk when you get here," Lisa said, feeling Eve's knees go weak in her own. "And Eve, drive careful, okay?" "Oh, okay." Breathing down the tears, Lisa walked back into the waiting area. "She's coming." His gaze grabbed hers. "You got a hold of her?" "She'll be here," Lisa said. Jeff looked up at the clock. "It's 8. I'd better go give Dustin the good news." Lisa nodded. "Yeah, I'll wait for Eve." "Good news, buddy," Jeff said when he pulled the chair over. "We finally got in touch with Eve. She's on her way. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were looking forward to having her for your nurse for a while. Yeah, don't deny it." He smiled half-heartedly at his own lame joke. "I'm going to try to talk them into letting her come in as soon as she gets here, even though it won't be visiting hours anymore. I know how much you want to see her, and how much she'll want to see you." The machine behind him screeched to life, and the bottom of Jeff's heart dropped through his feet as he turned to look at it. In 2 seconds, a host of green-clad workers were rushing into the room. Code blue, respiratory failure. For the second time in what seemed only moments, Jeff felt himself being pulled backward. We need to get in here, sir, please. In disbelieving horror, his body backed away, although not a single other piece of him did. The small jerks of the body on the bed sent fist-hard punches right through Jeff's gut. We're losing him. His blood pressure's dropping. Time and space floated away from Jeff's consciousness as he stood there in the corner, watching the scene, but never moving. Dustin was leaving, and somehow he had to find it within himself to let him go. It's okay, buddy, he whispered so that only the spirit now floating above them could hear. I'll take care of Eve for you. I will. You do what you have to. A solid beep permeated the air around him. I'll take care of her, I promise. At the door to the waiting area, Jeff's steps slowed until he couldn't even be sure he was still moving. However, the moment he emerged through the door, Lisa was there, worried and confused. What happened? All the alarms went off and... Words wouldn't come as Jeff looked into her eyes, and the message was received in the next second. Oh my God, no. She covered her mouth to stop the words. Oh, Jeff, no. I'm so sorry. Her hand reached over to his shoulder, and for that moment, he needed to be in someone's arms more than he ever had before. Warm, tender, and alive, she surrounded him in her embrace and just stood there, holding him as though she would never again let him go. And with that, life and death met in a silent embrace. The warmth of the windows as the sun dipped below the horizon at their backs did nothing to thaw Lisa's dead-cold spirit. Dustin was gone. Eve would be here any minute. Jeff looked like he might pass out any second, and somehow she had to find the courage to help them all, even though what she really wanted to do was curl up in a dark corner and cry her eyes out. When the elevator dinged, they both looked over to it. With a quiet whoosh, the doors slid open, and Eve rushed out, wild-eyed with panic as she looked around for what to do next. A moment too long, Lisa hesitated, and in her place, Jeff stood, looking far too steady for the shifting her world felt like it was doing. Jeff, what happened? Where is he? Eve asked, rushing toward them, her feet going as fast as her words. Lisa saw the breath he took and the square of his shoulders when he faced Eve and put out his arms to soften the blow. He didn't make it, Jeff said softly. Oh no, Eve said as her hand went to her mouth and her knees buckled. No. Jeff seemed not even to notice the bandages as his hands and arms caught her on the way down. Gently, he took her to a chair and sat her down. The torment in her eyes when she looked up at him tore Lisa's heart right out of her chest. She could never have found the words to continue. However, carefully, as Jeff sat on his heels in front of the woman who had suddenly become a widow, he looked unnervingly calm. Dustin said that he loves you. He wanted you to know that, Jeff said quietly. Okay? He did. He loved you so much, Eve. And when Eve leaned forward into Jeff's arms, there was no way anyone would have questioned that the feeling was mutual. This has been To Protect and Serve, Volume 1 of the Courage series. Written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings. This has been a Braveheart Audiobooks production.
You don't want to miss what comes next. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.